I've always been fascinated by the idea of consensus. The wide body of public opinion agreeing in the same direction is an interesting phenomenon to me, one I've wanted to research for some time now. The issue was always some questions holding me back, such as what did I want to dive into, what topic, what angle did I want to tackle the research from. Statistics are not foreign to me as a major sports fanatic, but researching numbers in the sports medium is something people already do at the professional level. The very best are being paid a lot of money to crunch numbers in sports, so I can't offer anything new there. So, this is where my other passion comes in to help fill that statistical void. As much as sports make up a large part of my identity, video games make up an even larger share of what makes me, well, me. To give a brief summary on the history of video games, the earliest known example of the initial video game can be traced back to the late 1950s, so just over 60 years has there really been what we know as video gaming. But the technological advancements in those 60-ish years have been nothing short of amazing. To think that the NES/Famicom and the PlayStation 5 are separated by only around 35 years is mind-boggling, and many incredible video gaming achievements have been produced within this time span. The best of the best. And whether there's a way we've reached consensus on the best of the best is what I'd like to explore today. Consensus, by definition, is a general agreement on a subject or topic. Easy enough. And there are examples of consensus being reached in an area of discussion. To dip into my sports fandom, it's widely believed that Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player to ever play the game, which he better hang on to as LeBron James is coming closer and closer to him. Same consensus has been reached with Wayne Gretzky over in the hockey world. He's known as the Great One for a reason. But the trickiest aspect of determining consensus is video gaming is quite possibly the most personal medium of entertainment in existence, which makes it the most difficult to measure, an interactive experience for the specific consumer. Each player will have a different experience playing a game, and each player will have different elements they favor over others. In sports, we have hard data and stats at our disposal to compare and contrast players. This can get dicey when we factor in different eras of play, potentially inflating or deflating stats, but regardless, stats are vital to the sports discussion world. This isn't really possible for video gaming, maybe in graphical capabilities between games, but it's still a stretch to say there is a statistical method to reaching consensus in the video gaming world. It's based on player experience, impact on the consumer themselves. But let's have a little fun with the idea. What if we came up with a means to measure all-time great games? Not an entire formula yet, but perhaps a start, a statistical baseline. To do this, we're going to use something rather crude and potentially controversial depending on who you ask. We're going to do a deep dive into the greatest video game of all time lists, posted by certain online publications and websites to help create our baseline. If you're familiar with politics in any form or fashion, think of it like how the website 538 pulls their polling averages from different pollsters across the country. They themselves do not have a poll, but they've created an aggregate polling average pulling from the actual pollsters, implementing a formula to offset biases. We're going to do that with these lists, just without the formula, because that's hard and I'm not quite good enough as a statistician to be able to do something like that yet. Now, there's a lot of potential shenanigans that can pop up from this endeavor, and it would be completely understandable. To try my best to answer some immediate concerns, I'll raise two potential problems that could spoil the data sample. 1. How am I choosing which websites to pull from? This is a valid concern. Researching who I should choose for my list database, I came across a website called VideoGameCanon.com, which has been compiling lists stretching back as far as 1995. According to the site, their method is using lists that offer, quote, at least 50 games, some form of editorial oversight, lists made up solely of reader polls or fan voting were excluded, and no restrictions on release dates or platforms. Truthfully, this is very close to the criteria I was looking for. Another important aspect I wanted was no limits of one game per franchise, which is an arbitrary restriction that I don't believe in. Maybe for a top 10 list I can squint hard enough and see a reason for, but when counting the greatest 100 video games, every game worth considering in a franchise should be considered for the list. The second question, could I be projecting a data bias using a collection of lists that pushes a certain narrative? Also a fair concern, and one I've done my best to try and avoid. The best way I could think to avoid this issue is to search for bigger and, if possible, more reputable websites to pull from, gaming or otherwise. Along with outlawing the one game per franchise rule, I also wanted to keep the lists recent up to 2020, to have rankings from as much of the gaming pool as possible and a solid cutoff date considering 2021 is still ongoing as of the making of this video. Lastly, if at all possible, was to make sure the lists were made by a committee of staff, not a single person, to ensure each list was a group effort instead of a singular opinion. I hope the narrow focus and tighter criteria are able to assuage any hesitancy regarding bias. It truly is not my intention to sell an angle. I love listicles and combing through stats, nothing more. Using Video Game Canon as a reference, I chose these 14 outlets, with no list being older than 2015 with the exception of G4's, which I decided to include considering it's still one of the only instances where a list dedicated to video games was presented on television to a national audience. The events surrounding this list is enough for me to allow inclusion. Lists I've excluded are Hardcore Gaming 101's 2020 and Hyper's 2018 for being unranked lists, Games Radar Plus's 2015 for implementing a one game per franchise stipulation, and G.O.A.T Video Game's 2017 after looking into the site a little bit more and seeing it to be compared to a 4chan forum, which we're gonna go ahead and just stay away from. With all that being said, here are some of my findings when I looked into the rankings and started compiling stats. I'm going to present some notable franchises and their performances, giving the games that placed onto a list their peak placement across all 14 lists and their average placement. Remember, my intention is only to present data, not to scrutinize each list for including one thing over the other or placing one game higher or lower than someone else might. The wider internet already has that area covered. My goal is to collect stats and present some findings I thought were interesting in the name of research, to reach my ultimate goal of discovering whether consensus is possible when we create a statistical baseline. So, let's begin. First, let me explain some of the terminology I'm going to be using throughout the video. Average series ranking is the overall average ranking measured from each game in the series. Placings and placements are to be thought of as a unit of measurement. I'm using this term for the number of times a game showed up on a list at all, disregarding rank. The max number of placements a game can have is 14, as there are 14 lists. And total series placements is the total number of placements the series had, which will always be a whole number. So, I chose 13 franchises for my findings, emphasizing either high critical praise or a large amount of games to choose from. Ideally, they would have both. Of these 13 franchises and all games placed, the overall average ranking is 37, and the average and total number of placements for each franchise is 19.9, slightly skewed by the extremely high volume of placements from 2 franchises. If we remove those, it becomes a 14.3 average placements total. Now, which franchises am I talking about? Let's jump into those ones first. Mario is the first one we're going to look at, and unsurprisingly we have a lot of representatives. I decided to include any game with Mario in the title under the same umbrella for the sake of uniformity, easily giving us the largest franchise to sift through. When looking at the numbers, Super Mario Kart and Super Mario 64 lead the charge with 9 placings each out of 14 total lists. However, Super Mario World and Super Mario Bros. 3 were the most successful in average placement. In 8 placings, Mario World averaged a 12.4 ranking, which is stunning considering the high volume of placements. And yet Mario Bros. 3 beats this with an average ranking of 6.3 in 7 placements, meaning half the lists that placed it had a very positive opinion of the game. Understandable for what many think to be the greatest platformer game of all time. At a whopping 63 total placements, by far the highest amount among every franchise in the video, Mario scored a 32 in average ranking, slightly above the overall average, so not too shabby. The next blockbusting franchise we'll look at is Zelda, who is also responsible for the skewed overall placements average with 39 total series placements, second highest behind Mario. Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time lead the way for Zelda, both maxing at 11 placements each with Breath of the Wild behind them at 7 placements. What's stunning about this dataset is Ocarina of Time's peak ranking though. Up to this point, I haven't mentioned peak ranking since it's more of a decorative stat, one that's aesthetic and useful to showcase a game's top end only, but I decided to take note of it as well. And here is an interesting case where it comes in handy. Ocarina of Time had a peak ranking of number 2, meaning it was never chosen as the number 1 game among the lists we're looking at today, where Breath of the Wild, Link to the Past, and even Majora's Masks all earned a number 1 somewhere. However, Ocarina of Time did score the best average ranking on very high volume, nailing a 19.3 average in 11 placements for the highest average in the series. Zelda's overall average series ranking clocks in at a 25.7, more than 11 points better than the average, also making it the highest ranked series we're going to talk about. Zelda has given it an impressive showing for sure in these lists. When choosing game series, I came away with a big 3 of sorts that best fit my ideal criteria of both high critical praise and large volume of games to choose from. Mario and The Legend of Zelda were 1 and 2, and the Final Fantasy series is the 3 in this big 3. With a high number of games just in the mainline series, I'll say I was a little surprised that only 6 total games placed, with one of them being Final Fantasy Tactics, a spin-off. Not to say it's undeserving of course, it's a terrific game. But back to the numbers. Final Fantasy 6 and 7 led the charge for this series, 7 clocking in at 10 placements and 6 with, well, 6. Interestingly, 6 had the higher peak at number 2, where 7 peaked at number 4. With its two anchors averaging a 16.7 ranking for 6 and a 34.8 ranking for 7, Final Fantasy came out with a slightly underwhelming 36.2 average series ranking considering their strength, brought down somewhat by the one placement games of Final Fantasy 4, 9, and 12, which came in at 53, 58, and 97 respectively. Tough break, but still above the 37 overall average ranking, so not too bad. Metal Gear's inclusion here is based primarily on the consistent critical and commercial appraisal it's received over the years, with Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater remaining among the most beloved games on the respective consoles. Metal Gear Solid leads the series with 8 placements and Snake Eater at 5, and also has the highest peak at number 14 with Snake Eater peaking at number 21. Both games are somewhere near the average in ranking, Snake Eater coming in at a 34.8 and Metal Gear Solid at a 35.9, so both just above the 37 total average ranking. And when you include the other 2 placement games in the series, 1 placement Peace Walker and 1 placement Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, the series average ranking sits at a 35.5. Metal Gear is one of my personal favorite video game series, so to see it do well relative to the big 3 brings a pretty good smile to my face. The big mother of them all, Doom is one of the most important franchises in video game history, kickstarting an entire new genre of game and finishing the revolution Wolfenstein 3D started. As for their list performance, the one that started it all leads the series with 10 placements out of 15 total for the series, peaking at a number 4 and averaging a 28.5 ranking. A stunning ranking performance on high placement volume. However, Doom becomes the first video game series we've talked about to finish below the 37 ranking average, because of somewhat lacking performances by its other placers, Doom 2 and Doom 2016. Doom 2 did nicely to peak at number 12, but the following 86 and 95 rankings dropped the game average to a 64.3. And Doom 2016's 2 placements in the lower half of both its lists means Doom's series average ranking finishes at 42. No list I examined has found a place for Doom Eternal yet, though understandable considering how recently it was released. But there's no guarantee it would make a list in general, and no way to know whether it would help or hurt the Doom series average. Only time will tell then. Say what you will about the Call of Duty series, but to say it's been unsuccessful since the release of the watershed Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare would be a complete lie. In what can be described as a carry job if you look at it a certain way, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is responsible for 8 of the series' total 11 placements, peaking at number 7 and averaging a 40 overall ranking, which seems reasonable since the volume of placements is pretty high. Modern Warfare's average stays pretty in line with the series' overall average ranking, which when filling out the rest of the 1 placement Call of Duty Black Ops, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we end with the 40.7 average, below the overall average, but still not bad at all. This one is going to be a bit interesting, but I hope you can understand why I did what I did with this series. Because of the similarity in overall style, made intentionally due to the fact that they both came from the same development studio and the same creative director in Hidetaka Miyazaki, I'm grouping the Souls series with Bloodborne to present them as the Soulsborne series for this exercise. What we end with is Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne pushing forward with 7 placements each, Dark Souls 2 and Demon Souls giving us 1 more placement each for a series total of 16 placements. Dark Souls 1 peaks at number 2 and Bloodborne peaks at number 5, but we have a pretty wide disparity in average ranking between the two. Bloodborne clocks in with a 38.7 average ranking, but Dark Souls blasts it out of the water with a 23.3 average. Absolute domination from Dark Souls, and well deserved for a game that virtually invented a new genre. Maybe it's a similar scenario to Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, to where Demon Souls walked so Dark Souls could run, but I digress. Influential no matter what way you slice it. Halo is another series I have a personal attachment to, but only up to a certain point. Personally, I'm pleased to see the game I sunk hundreds of hours into split-screen multiplayer with my brothers on is also the flag-bearing representative for the series. Halo Combat Evolved leads the way with 9 placements and a peak of number 3, where it also sits solidly at a 30.6 overall average ranking, a great showing on high volume. And luckily, Combat Evolved also received some help from the wings, as Halo 2 and 3 combine for a total of 6 placements and peak at number 13 and number 10 respectively. Thanks to Halo 2 and 3's overall average rankings being a 40.5 and a 37.3, the overall series average ranking sits at a cozy 33.7, nicely above average for Xbox's first truly great series. Alright, I have to admit, when I chose the Sonic the Hedgehog series, it was mostly with the understanding that he was the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis's mascot and the killer app. Blast processing, anyone? The series maintains a massive audience, and the 2D side-scrollers are considered all-time classics. When digging into the lists, however, I was shocked by how little Sonic is represented in lists from the past 6 years plus G4. Only the original Sonic and Sonic the Hedgehog 2 place at all, but with a marginal 3 placements each. Sonic 2's peak was number 12, which is impressive for sure, but Sonic 1's peak at number 21 leaves a little to be desired considering what the game meant to the war with Nintendo back in the mid-90s. An overall series average ranking of 40.6 doesn't sit too far below the total average, which is okay, but I'm still stunned that other games within the series didn't receive recognition. Sonic & Knuckles, Sonic CD, and even sometimes Sonic Mania are many fans' favorite games and are each sometimes considered the best Sonic game in the series depending on who you ask, so to see none of these games placed is disheartening to say the least. I'm sorry Sonic, this one's on me. I truly didn't want to make you look bad. I swear it's only because I had already crunched the numbers that I included you. Metroid is the ultimate low-volume, high-efficiency franchise in the Nintendoverse. What I mean by that is, although there are not a lot of games in the series, specifically mainline series, basically every entry is a landmark title in some sense, except Other M. The one game that has been consistently given Super Nintendo GOAT consideration as often as a game like Link to the Past or Final Fantasy VI is Super Metroid, and that's reflected in the numbers. 9 placements, a number 4 peak, and an average ranking of 25.9 are the type of numbers a contender puts up. Heck of a showing from Super Metroid. And then we can also bring up Metroid Prime, one of the most stunning debuts in video game history who also had a solid showing with 7 placements. Though sporting a number 7 peak, an overall average ranking of 46.6 for Metroid Prime cools off the momentum a little bit, but we end up with a 39.2 overall series average. This is not a bad showing at all for a series that's been somewhat neglected by Nintendo since its inception. Red Dead Redemption kinda breaks my criteria just a little bit, but I decided to include it emphasizing the critical praise rather than the large game pool. Ultimately, I think it's worth including if for no other reason than out of curiosity for Red Dead Redemption 1's performance. I expected a good showing based on fan feedback that I've seen in the past, and it pulled through with my expectations, scoring a whopping 10 placements, the most so far of any game I've recorded past the year 2000. And ranking performance also holds up. A peak of number 8 and an overall average ranking of 31.2 is a pretty solid showing. Red Dead Redemption 2 is so new that it's hard to hedge just exactly how much impact it will have on rankings in the future, after a little more time has passed. But in the meantime, an average ranking of 47.3 for the game leads the Red Dead series to an overall series average of 34.9. Low volume, high efficiency, solid all around. 2 more series left to talk about. Now, I was throwing off my expectations a bit with Fallout because I fully expected Fallout 3 to be the anchor of the series, and you would think so considering a series high 6 placements, but a peak of number 30, average ranking of 45.7, not what I was anticipating. And neither was I anticipating the powerhouse that Fallout New Vegas apparently is, albeit on low volume. New Vegas shocks the world with a number 5 peak in just 2 placements and scores a series average of 21. Again, low volume, but that's still pretty crazy. Fallout 2 and OG Fallout's performances bring down the series average to a 47.3 unfortunately. The takeaway from the numbers is Fallout has not been overly successful in its run of GOAT lists, but New Vegas is doing its best to put in work. It just can't win with these cats, I guess. The final series we're going to talk about is probably my single personal favorite, as I've played all the mainline games so far and a few of them multiple times. So with a tiny bit of investment, I was hoping to see Resident Evil come in with a good showing. And sure enough, Resident Evil 4 delivered like it should. Topping Red Dead Redemption for most placements by a game released past 2000, a staggering 12 placements gives the series a very solid showing of 31.9 average ranking on insane volume. Resident Evil 4 is in my personal top 10 video games ever made, so this is sort of validating for me. The other representatives for the series bring the overall series average down a bit, with Resident Evil 2, 2 Remake, and a wild Veronica appearance round out the average to a 42.4. Again, we run into an issue here where Resident Evil 2 Remake is just too new to gauge properly on the average, but it has already placed on a list, so just like Red Dead 2, we'll leave it in. I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised the Resident Evil Remake didn't earn any placings, but Resident Evil 4 has proven to be more than capable of picking up the slack. So, where does this dataset leave us? Well, it gives us a start for a small number of series, but which are responsible for 60 total games placed. And of course, while I did what I could to mention series that included at least one game with serious GOAT contentions, there are plenty of other series or single games we could have looked at for consideration as well. The Last of Us, BioShock, Minecraft, The Witcher, Half-Life. With the data we've gotten from the sample size within the parameters I set, are we close to finding consensus? With a rough statistical baseline established, the 37 total average among well-known series with at least one highly regarded entrant, let's look at the top individual game averages. To weed out the low-volume placers, let's make the minimum placement 7, to say it needed to place on at least half the lists to qualify. At a glance, other than the utter domination by Nintendo, there's a sizable gap between our top ranker, Super Mario Bros. 3, our second place Super Mario World, and our third place Ocarina of Time in this chart. Though the order is different, this is pretty in line with my initial expectations, and I doubt there would be much argument if a brand new top 100 all-time list had those 3 games at the very top in whichever order. So, we did it? We reached consensus? Well, no. I'd go so far to say, not even close. For consensus in the video game world, you really can't measure it like you can the greatest basketball player ever, kinda like how we mentioned earlier. Or rather, it's significantly more difficult to measure it. I created a statistical baseline to weigh, but 14 lists within the past 6 years plus G4's 2012 is not really a wide-reaching net considering the years of history we have to sift through. Make no mistake, though the spreadsheet I used to compile this data looks intimidating when zoomed out, this is still technically a small sample size. That's okay for now, as my goal for the time being is seeing if we could establish a statistical baseline at all. Though we did, the parameters are still somewhat narrow. And that's the thing about statistics in a competitive medium. The parameters used to collect data can come out as somewhat arbitrary. For example, my data range was top 100 lists released in 2012, G4's, and from 2015 through 2020, based on certain qualifications to confirm merit. If I want a wider data pool, I could cast the net out to lists released in the 2000s, such as Empire Online's 2009 or GameSpot's 2003, which spans all the way through to 2007. The problem becomes we lose consideration from the Dark Souls series, which wasn't released yet and features one of the highest ranked games in lists since its release. We come across 3 problems in data collecting for consensus on the greatest games of all time. 1, for as much consideration as possible, ideally you want the most recent list to feature the most possible representation. But when you do factor in a brand new list, how accurately can that reflect the most recent games released around the time of said list? It doesn't seem fair to Resident Evil and Red Dead Redemption that 2 very recent games that just so happen to place negatively impacts the series average due to how recent those games and lists were released. Number 2. Anyone can set any stipulations to the data collection, but it's especially dicey in this field because data collection for all-time great game lists doesn't really exist. I did my absolute best to devise a set of parameters that were fair, balanced, and without bias because my goal is to figure out if consensus is possible, not to prove one game is the consensus best. And even then, I still wouldn't blame anybody for claiming bias since it's my rule set that I was going by. And number 3, and probably most important, publications and video game websites are creating these lists out of love and respect for the games that they either grew up playing or have spent their adult lives writing about. Now, a cynic might say it's also to manufacture outrage and drive clicks, but let's take the rankings at face value for now. Their lists are for tribute, not to add to an aggregate database. In other words, GOAT game lists aren't really meant to be collected and averaged out because they're crafted out from opinion and experience, not objective observation. While that's not to say GOAT lists in the world of sports are also created specifically from objective observation, but they're able to craft arguments out of objective observation and not only purely from opinion and experience. If all these problems were going to rear their ugly heads, why did I spend all this time finding averages, creating spreadsheets in a potentially fruitless hunt? Well, because it's fun. I find it fun. And I think there may be a way to find consensus with a little bit more, for lack of a better term, regulation with how we collect the data. I'm willing to have some fun with the idea of treating all-time lists as objective box scores, but we'll be coming back with a bit more nuance to the list pooling process. Before we do any more data collection and averaging, we need to determine how and where to choose from and stick to a process. Next time, this is what we're going to work on. With that being said, thank you all for watching. I hope you've had a good day so far. I hope you're having a good night so far. I hope you enjoyed the process that we laid out and the information that was presented in this video, and I hope to see you all next time.